Welcome to the Storypowers Podcast, a show about the power of stories, the people who tell them, and why you should be doing it too. I'm your host, keynote speaker and storytelling coach, Francisco Mahfuz. My guest today is Jeff Davenport. Jeff oversees Lighthouse Point, a company that helps people communicate with clarity, confidence, and a light that points listeners and audiences to where they need to go. Jeff's mission is to turn them from timid, scattered, and boring presenters into mighty communicators. He's also produced screenwriter and spent almost 7 years as an executive speaker coach and senior content developer at Duarte, working with some of the world's largest companies. To be fair, there's not much that Jeff can't do. Well, apart from cutting his own hair, he's pretty terrible at that. But then again, who isn't? Ladies and gentlemen, Jeff Davenport. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks. How are you?
I am alright. And as I told you before we started, you might not be in good hands, but you are in hands.
You're in hands. As long as I'm in hands, everything's gonna be okay.
Right. So I wanted to start by clarifying this bone I might have to pick with you.
Oh,
Okay.
good. Let's start off. Let's start off with something really juicy. Good.
So the concern here that might not be true, but that my concern is that you and you and the good people at Duarte, who you used to work with for a long time, you might have brought some storytelling evil into the world. So I just want to make sure I go through that first and we get that bone out of the way. Right. So let me tell you what I'm talking about.
All right.
A lot of people that I speak to, one of their biggest pet peeves, and other people in the storytelling world that I speak to, one of their biggest pet peeves with people trying to do or teach storytelling in business is the hero's journey. So the hero's journey comes up over and over as this very complicated thing, according to them, that a lot of people teach as one of the ways to do storytelling in business. And when asked, who is teaching people that? One of the big proponents of either the hero's journey or some version of the hero's journey is Duarte. She has a very famous TED talk where she goes through her structure, or at least one of her structures. So what I wanted to ask from you, who's worked there for a long time, is one, is that something you actually taught people? And if so, are all the naysayers wrong?
Well, I have nothing but positive things to say about Duarte and Nancy Duarte. She is as bright and insightful and wonderful as a human being as you're ever going to find. She's great. When we talk about the hero's journey, I think Duarte and most companies talk about it in very high-minded terms. We rarely would look at a client and say, okay, you're going to tell a story, so I want you to hit all 18 of these beats, and you're going to do this. Hardly any stories. Here's a dirty secret. You ready for a dirty secret, Francisco? We all love trotting out old Campbell, but the fact is, we rarely come across stories that hit all of those beats. That just rarely happens. And I would even say that rarely happens in movies. We come to Campbell not because we're like, well, I really want to think about the Gilgamesh epic. We come to Campbell because we go, well, I think this worked in some movies. And I think the operative word there is some. It worked in some movies. And most movies don't hit all of those beats. And I like reading sometimes these books that decide, okay, I'm gonna take this movie and put it on the bed of the hero's journey, and you realize they're having to do these gymnastics to try to cram all of this in. I don't think that's normally the case. I think I know what Duarte in general, and now me out on my own, what we draw from the hero's journey are very simple concepts. A story is about a person, a team, or an organization that's wanting to get somewhere, stuff's standing in the way. Somehow they get past that stuff, and yay, they get what they wanted. And Nancy would say consistently, a real story is about transformation. And I like that. I think that's very much in line with Campbell. But boy, again, you'd be hard pressed to see us at any point in my career sitting down with an executive who has to give a big keynote, and they go, okay, we're going to write a story, and I let me pull out the hero's journey circle. They lose their minds because no story is going to fall that way. Do you agree with that? Has that been your experience?
Yes, I agree with that, and I think that the points you mentioned, or the beats you mentioned, to use a screenwriting term, and I have plenty of screenwriting terms in my head now because I'm making my way through McKee's story, but what it becomes almost ironic is that if all you're getting out of the hero's journey are those very basic beats, then it's not a hero's journey. Then it's Aristotle's Poetics. Maybe you throw a guide in there, or throw a couple of other points in the hero's journey. But I don't know. Might just be a rumor or an urban legend, or maybe there's just some really crappy trainers out there that are genuinely trying to get this 7 points or 10 points or 12 points or whatever, 18 points from their hero's journey into people's heads. But I've seen people defend it. I've seen people defend, like, at least on social media, oh yes, there's a use for everything. But it's interesting to find that someone who's supposedly one of the biggest proponents of that type of thing, that it's actually not quite anywhere near as convoluted as that in the way you would normally approach it, at least.
I think it's the general idea, and so it's almost like we all have glommed onto the title, Hero's Journey. Oh, great. I can tell a story about a hero who goes on a journey. When you start to get into the really specific nitty-gritty bits, things start to go out the window. I look at the hero's journey beats as a menu, and as many of those as we can grab, great. I'd be hard-pressed to say that anyone's story that they're telling hits all of those beats. I had attended film school at the University of Southern California and studied screenwriting, and I was there, how many years was I there? 3 years. And to be honest, we never studied the hero's journey. That was not something when I was there that was prominent for screenwriting even. We thought about things from a number of different perspectives, but coming back to Campbell was not something that we did. We thought about it in other structure forms, and the structures were a little bit more loose. So it's a bit of a canard to say that if you know the hero's journey, you're halfway there, you're ready to go, you're ready to tell a story. But you do want to tell a story about an individual, a team, or an organization going on a journey and ultimately transforming in some way.
So this is something I don't think there's a perfect answer to this, but it's one of the questions that come up more often in this podcast is the question of structure, right? Because the one thing I find hurts people when they look at the hero's journey as some sort of guide to telling a story is that it is very difficult, if you're not writing fiction, to look at a structure with all those steps you're trying to follow and go, okay, I'm going to do this now, I'm going to do that. Because a real life story, you then have to twist it, as you said, twist it out of shape so you can maybe hit those bits. So the question I'm trying to ask in a very convoluted way is, how much did you find in your corporate work that people actually benefited from being given a structure that they then tried to use to develop their stories, and how much the structure was more maybe a checklist of realizing, okay, well, this is what's missing from the story. If you look at the structure, this part here is missing, but not something they would use to start the development of a story with.
I would say, yeah, the checklist might be a better way of looking at it. I rarely handed over a list of beats and said, all right, I want you to fill this up. Usually what I would do is I would have them tell me the story. So we try to identify. For me, what I'm always looking for when I'm working with a client is I want to identify, what is the point you're trying to prove? You're trying to prove a point within this entire presentation, this entire speech, or in this specific moment. So what point are you trying to prove? And so then I'll interview them and get them to talk about something. Well, and I'm like, when have you seen this thing that you're proposing actually work? When have you seen someone not use it and things went awry? So we land on a story. And then once we've got that story, I start to look at it through the beats that I try to hit. And it might not hit all of those beats, but I find more often than not, it's going to hit most of them. And so that's when I'm taking the story and communicating back to the speaker. I want you to hit it in this order. And it will, in general, help your audience feel the story. So you know that sometimes great stories are just mistold. They're told out of order. They're told with too much, the proportions are wrong. They spend so much time on, well, let me tell you about this person and what they wanted, and then the end of the story hurries along. Or they don't spend enough time going, let me tell you about this team and what they were wanting, and then everything gets muddied. I would prefer, tell me your story. I'm going to parrot back to you via the beats that I think you should hit: meeting the hero, discovering the hero's goal, feeling those challenges that hero faces, understanding their current strategy, revealing a right strategy, applying the right strategy. There's some sort of fight that they fight to, and then ultimately overcome those challenges. And if it's a happy story, achieve the goal. I think most businesses' stories can hit those beats. Now, I don't look at my client and go, here's your beats. How does your story hit it? To be honest, most people can't think in those terms. They get all gummed up. Oh, that's fine. Well, that's why I'm here. I'm here to help you walk through those and try to identify those.
Well, I find it interesting that you are, at least when you did it just now, you're still using language that is very similar or came out of the hero's journey. And is that how you normally think of like the beats, as you say? Do you always think of them in those terms, or is that language that you picked up specifically by working in the corporate world or with Duarte?
It's an amalgamation, right? I would say that where I have landed on story is what I've read in Campbell, Aristotle, what I've experienced with working with my corporate clients, what I experienced when I was writing screenplays. These were the ways I thought about stories. Now, no, I think anybody's lying to you if they go, well, I've got the story structure. Let me tell you, I've got it all figured out. I just don't think that's the case. I think what we're doing is we're trying, every guest you have on, right? Am I wrong on this? Every guest you have on has some sort of story structure that they try to get people to follow. And we're all just doing our best to get a general idea of how can we take this. I had a colleague at Duarte. She loved a story like that. Oh man, like it was in her veins. And she would often talk about what a mysterious, she personified it. What a mysterious being we're working with when we're working with story. And she's right. Like this is a mysterious thing. We don't fully understand. I mean, we can talk about the oxytocin and the dopamine and all the brain science, but when it comes down to it, we're not altogether clear why us humans like stories. There's lots of great theories. The Storytelling Animal that book hits a bunch of those. Story or Die, Lisa Cron's book hits a bunch of those. There's lots of good theories about that. I think all of us story folk, we're just trying to figure out how can we find a structure that hits at least most stories so that we can help people have some handles on it. I think most people find story unwieldy. I was thinking about it this morning. My father passed away suddenly about a year ago, and I was at my parents' house, and I was talking with my mom, and she said, your dad had just bought this circular saw, and it's in the box. Do you want to take it back to, I'm from Houston, and she said, do you want to take it back to Denver with you? I'm like, well, yeah, I guess so, sure. And so I took this. I don't have a saw. I mean, I got one of these kind of saws, but I don't have like an electric saw, and I thought, well, this will be good. And it's been a year now, and I was just out in my garage, and that saw is still sitting in the box on my workbench. And I was looking at it and thinking about it and thinking, that's a little like, get ready, tenuous metaphor alert. I was looking at that thinking, I was thinking about it more this morning, but I was thinking, that's like story. We all know, boy, this is going to be a good thing. We really should use this. This is really important. And yet it's still in the box. Like we haven't pulled it out. And I was thinking, well, why haven't I used that saw? To be honest, Francisco, I'm afraid. I like all of these, and I don't want to lose any of the 10 fingers. I'm a little afraid I get that saw out and suddenly daddy's, looking like the shop teacher. And I don't want to lose a digit. And I think it's the same way with stories, that sometimes as a speaker, I know I need to tell a story. I just am afraid I'm going to botch it and mess it up. And I'll just stick with saying data things, and I'll just stick with telling people what to do, and I'll stick with those things. And, anybody I've got a good buddy who is skilled in woodwork, and he could show me how to use that saw and go, see, you're fine. You're going to be fine. It's not going to cut your finger off. And if it does, you got 9 others. You'll be fine. And I think in the same way, it's up to people like you and I and your other guests to talk to people and go, story is important. It's useful. We don't have to be afraid of it. I'm going to try my best to give you some handles so you don't cut off your proverbial finger.
It's interesting that a couple of the storytellers that I've been enjoying more, both from their teaching content but also from the stories they tell, are Matthew Dix, who keeps winning the Moth over and over and over when they have their I think he won the Moth now 52 times.
Wow.
Including a ton of Grand Slams. And when I asked him about it, I said, you wrote a whole book on storytelling and there's not a word on structure. And he said, I don't think of it as structure. The way he thinks of it, and I incorporated a lot of that, is he says, well, the story is 5 seconds, which is the transformation, when you stop being one thing and became the other. So if you're going to be someone who you've now learned the value of teamwork, then in the beginning of the story, at some point near the beginning, you need to be someone who doesn't know the value of teamwork. So we can see that change, start with location and time and action and all those usual things, just so it's not a boring exposition. Then tell us what happened, tell us what you did about it, and then drive it towards the end, and that's kind of it, right? which is pretty simple, but it's more about what needs to be in there, and not necessarily, although there's clearly an order, but it's like, is this thing in there? Is that enough for us to care about the character? Is that enough for us to really understand the stakes of the story? Yeah. And he assumes, correctly or wrongly, that it's very, very difficult for people to mess up that order. But then again, I've also spoken to plenty of people. I think I was speaking to Kendall Haven, and he was saying how he had this great storyteller that he knew, one of the Jay O'Callaghan. He's one of the legendary storytellers in the US, and he would just give these workshops and tell people, just listen to the rhythm of the story. The rhythm, just listen to the rhythm. And people had no idea what to do with that. So yeah, I find that interesting, and I find more and more that as I said before, structure is more of a checklist than something used to start a story. But I know also a lot of corporate people that say, you give them a framework, they love it, they kind of understand what goes where, because if you don't give them that, sometimes, although it sounds obvious to us, it doesn't seem to be. But there's one point you mentioned about how people are afraid of it and don't want to use it, like the saw you have in your garage. And one question I always have to different people who do this job is, when you teach, because you don't teach storytelling, you teach presentation skills and speaking and all of these things where story is one part of. So how big a part of those skills you're teaching is story? Like, were you always trying to get people to tell a story? Sometimes, not that often.
Yes, always. I'm trying to figure out some opportunity to get in there and say, okay, you've got all this data, content, all of this. Is there a place for a story? I'm going to consistently come back to that. So when it's about their content, yes, I want to find a place where we're going to tell a story. More often than not, I'm trying to push that story up to the front as much as possible. When it comes to delivery, how they're communicating, what they're communicating, usually those delivery things end up becoming, those delivery engagements end up becoming some sort of talk about the content. It's really challenging as a delivery coach to work with someone about how are you going to come across as clear and comfortable and charismatic if their content just blows. And so I'm trying to then also massage their content, and I'll go, hey, I think you're going to really get some good punch here. Your audience is going to lean in a little bit more if you've got a story here. How are you proving this? So you've got this point right here. You're proving it with data. Is there a way you can prove this with a story? And I have to disabuse them right there of the notion that I'm trying to get them to go, Gandalf was wandering around. No. All I want to know is, when did a customer experience this and it went well? And then when you kind of watch the scales fall from their eyes and they go, you mean it's just that? Yeah, it's just that. I just need you to tell me something about a time when the thing that you're proposing, this right strategy that you're proposing, actually worked. Or when someone didn't use that right strategy and things fell apart for them. And they go, oh, well, we always tell this story. Or, actually, just this week I was talking to somebody about this. Great. And then we put it in there, and you just feel their shoulders fall a little bit and go, oh, this isn't as intimidating as I thought. So I try to bring it in as often as possible.
I found a trick, Jeff, and the trick is, you say to them, okay, so this is your point. So do you have any real life examples that prove that point? And they go, you mean like a story? I was like, if you want to call it that, an example.
That's right. We overthink this story thing. I mean, it has, it's just, it becomes this. We over talk about it, right? I feel like God bless you, this is your podcast. You talk about how to help. But I think people it becomes this big giant thing that becomes intimidating, and I don't know. Or we assume we're better at it than we actually are. And okay, yeah, it's an example. Or it's just a case study. There's oftentimes I start talking about story, and the client or the customer, you can tell that they're wising up and they're leaning in and they're going, you're just talking about a case study. And I look back at them and go, I know. That's all I'm talking about. You do this all the time anyway. I'm just trying to get you to do it strategically and intentionally. And when they get that, oh, okay, the barrier to entry goes down. And then we structure it. I try to move some things around. I think one of the things you were talking about as you were talking about when it goes well and when it doesn't is so often I'm working with people on the setup. Like, how many times have we been at a dinner party or hanging out with a friend and they tell a story and they get to the end and they go, oh, you know what? I meant to tell you this at the beginning. And because they didn't tell us this, we will logically get where they were trying to go, but we don't feel it. And there's nothing more frustrating to me when a client tells a story and they've missed some key element in the setup, like you were talking, like, oh, they didn't value teamwork. And then the big transformation is they came to value teamwork. Oh, I meant to tell you that they didn't at the beginning. Okay, well, then I don't feel your story. So I'm often trying to go, what are the beats we need to hit at the beginning that are going to set things up? Why? So we know the character better and all that? Sure, but it's all in service of the ending, the punchline. We want that punchline of the story to land, and you can only identify that transformation if you have identified well how things started. These are the films that I love. Not all movies, I'll be honest, not all movies are about character transformation. And I would even say not all movies I like are about character transformation. You'd be hard-pressed to find a James Bond movie where James Bond really learns a valuable lesson by the end. He's James Bond. He's going shooting people and doing what he does. But the movies that have a lasting impact on me, and I think for most of us, are those movies where there is a clear setup of the character at the beginning, and there's a clear setup of that character's, for lack of a better term, flaw or missing piece. And by the end, that flaw has been corrected and that missing piece has been filled in. Michael Arndt, who wrote Toy Story 3, and he was a writer on some of the new Star Wars movies. He has a great bit on this that he talks about. I think it's on the Toy Story 3 extras or something. But when he sat down to write that movie, he didn't know what to do. He's seen Woody and Buzz and all of this, and he started off with, he realized the great Pixar movies are the ones that start off with a character we love. There's something about them that's fun, funny, whatever. We just like them, and yet something's off. And we're going to correct that something off by the end. And in the same way, I think That sounds so highfalutin to apply that thinking to a business story, but it's not. Hey, our team was bad at teamwork and we got good at teamwork because we tried this thing and did that. Hooray! It's simple as that.
I want to come back to James Bond because I think James Bond is an interesting case in how it connects to business storytelling. But there was something you said before that I don't think I'm challenging you. I'm challenging what your client said, which was, oh, you're just talking about a case study. Where I think that a story and a case study are drastically different, and the reason one of the reasons I say this is just a few days ago, I was doing work with some of the students on the MBA where I do the communications coaching, and so they have this, they have to prepare the speeches or stories, and they share them, and we give them feedback, and often. So this was the storytelling session of the communications course. And the difference between someone telling a business story and someone doing a case study was just glaring. Because one person is saying, so it's 2 years ago and it's my first few weeks in this company and this is what we're doing. And then we're doing this and we're doing that. And then we hit upon this obstacle and we're trying to solve it. And the other person who's saying, the company I worked at, they were trying to do this, and that thing. And then this and that thing happened. And then they didn't know it's just the fact that it was being narrated from a third person, even though you are part of it, to a first person just changes drastically. And I said to him, listen, I do not give two shits for your company. Right? I want to hear about you. Like, what are you doing? Why does this matter to you? Or at least, why does it matter to the team? Why does it matter to the customers you're supposed to serve? Give me real people I can connect with. Whereas a case study often doesn't have real people. It's just a company, is the department, but it's just as disembodied entities. And I don't think we're built or evolved to connect with disembodied entities. So I think that the case study and the story are very different. Yeah.
Yes. I think the similarities are both of them are using a situation to prove something is true. And I think that's where the penny dropped for those clients when they said, oh, you mean it's just a case study? Well, what they meant was in their brains, case studies were designed to prove something was true. And I'm telling them, tell any story to prove something is true. I've thought a lot about what you're talking about because people do want to talk about a team or a company, an organization, sometimes even a whole nation. And yes, those stories can work, but I tell clients this all the time. Even when you're looking at an audience, you're not talking to an audience. You're talking to that person and that person and that person and that. You're talking to a room of individuals. You're talking to humans, not an audience. And in the same way, if you can get that story to zero in on a human being. So if you're going to talk to them about, well, the finance department needed to figure out this. Okay, that's fine. But I want you to tell me about the CFO. Or I want you to tell me about Jenny, the accountant, who had to make a decision. Because we as listeners do not identify with teams, organizations, and nations. We identify with individuals. Sports movies are a huge thing, I think, in the world, but I know especially in the United States. And you'll watch a sport movie about a team. And in your brain, you're like, this movie is about that team, but it's not. It's never about the team. We always walk away going, that one player, that was the one that really, I connected. Oh, well, I actually connected with that one. So yes, we're kind of following this team's trajectory from rags to riches, whatever it is. But really, it's always going to be about those individuals. So I'm with you. Now, there's going to be times where case studies will have to seem to come from this third person perspective, but as often as possible, narrow it down to the individual decision maker. That case study is a study in an organization or a team that transformed, but that didn't happen because everybody did it all. It happened because one or two people made a key decision. That's your hero. If you can, zero in on that individual human being. And that's going to help your audience go, I'm like that person. I could make that decision. And that could affect my team. And, good things come out of that. So I think you're right on about that. Now, how does that connect to James Bond?
Well, I'll get to James Bond. Just one more thing. which is why, as we were talking, I was thinking about how happy I was when my wife got completely shafted by her previous employer, and the reason that happened, well, that's a hook for you there,
Yeah.
is I had this big keynote to HR.com. Right, and I was going to speak into, I don't know, it was maybe 1,000 people, and 2 weeks before, my wife found another job, and as she was leaving the job, her employers just treated her really badly. Like they were nasty to her. They kind of basically said stuff like, how dare you leave us? How do you think this company is going to be better? We were so nice to you. We didn't sack you when you got pregnant. We let you work from home when everybody was in lockdown. That type of thing. And then she's like, well, and they said, oh, if this is how you feel about us, then there's no point in you serving your notice. And she's like, okay, fine, I'll go then. And then they gave her some stuff to sign. She signed it, got home, looked at the papers, and realized that they had deducted half of of a month's salary because she supposedly had never given her notice, and because she did it over the phone and she signed the papers, she had no recourse. So she essentially lost half a month's salary. And this happened 2 weeks before I was giving this HR lecture about culture, right? And then I was talking about the power of story and how you need individuals to make anyone care about what you're saying. And I said to them, listen, if I talk to you about the thousands of people every not a year, every day probably in America that leave a job, and because they don't know any better, they get shafted out of money, or they lose things that were their rights, you might care a tiny bit about it, but I'm pretty sure you wouldn't want to go on social media and make, torch the company's reputation because you heard that they might have done this over the years. But let's just try something different. And then I shared the story about my wife, and I said, so how do you feel now? And most people are like, oh, that is outrageous. No one should be able to do this. Like, yeah, and you don't even know my wife. Like, trust me, she's way nicer than I am, but you don't even know her, and now you care. Whereas the facts are the same. Right?
That's right.
Why do you care now? Because it's one person. It's if I made 10 people, you wouldn't care so much. It's one person. Right? So if I make it about one person and one thing that happened to the person, one moment in time, it's a lot easier for us to care. So yeah, we're clearly in agreement there.
I love that, because don't our brains assume that person, your wife, isn't just your wife. She represents many people, and we assume often when we tell about teams or organizations that their brains will do the work and bring it down to the individual level. And that's asking a lot. That's asking a lot of an audience. And I'd rather go straight to the individual and assume they're going to interpret that out to the larger group than the other way around. Our brains, we're people, and we think about humans. We don't think about lots of humans necessarily.
Yeah, so that I find less mysterious than the fact that when you talk about very specific things that other people have not experienced the same way, they relate more to your story than if you use the generic thing. So for example, if I'm talking about going to school, and I'm talking about going to school in Brazil, and I describe something that will be very specific to the classrooms in Brazil, that is not the classrooms you experienced in America, you are now thinking about how your classroom was in America. Whereas if I say, oh, in just a normal classroom, it's harder for you to remember your own classroom than if I picked one detail about a desk or about a chair. So there's this weird thing where you pick specific details and then everybody's co-creating the story with their own details. That I find more mysterious than why we connect to one person and not to many. But James Bond. So James Bond is a very strange case when it comes to storytelling, because he might be the perfect example, the James Bond movie, the perfect example of what not to do when you're trying to influence anyone or connect with anyone, because a James Bond story is mostly about entertainment than anything else, but it's aspirational. You want to be James Bond, really. Like, you're not at all like James Bond. I think in general, you're not going, yes, I'm just like him. Like, no, you're not. Right? I think unless you're pretty clueless about yourself, you're not like James Bond. And I think that a lot of people, when they think about using stories in business, they might fall for that trap of, I need to be James Bond in the story. I need to be super competent. I need to be a high achiever. I need to do all these things, and that is probably the opposite of what. Not in the achievement. You can still achieve things, but you shouldn't achieve them in a suave and smooth way, because that, I think that would defeat the purpose of using, or at least one of the main purposes of using a story, which is make it relatable and have people that have problems relate to the problems you've overcome, and not to, how cool you are and that they want to be like you.
Again, if a James Bond movie started with him being this schlub, and by the end he's James Bond and he's got it, great, because what you've talked about is transformation. But there's not many James Bond movies, I'm trying to think, there's just not many that have any sort of transformation there. I think they are entertaining, and I've racked my brain trying to figure out, this is what a nerd I am. I sit around thinking often, why do certain films or books bring us in when it seems to break the mold? And by mold, I mean we are individuals who want to see ourselves as becoming better versions of ourselves. And so we're constantly looking for movies and entertainment that affirm that change is possible. Okay, I'll go along with that. I can think about all the movies my wife and I watch and go, that hits most of them. And then I hit something like a James Bond movie, or I hit something like, I would say to a large degree, like an Indiana Jones movie. One of these movies that you're watching someone just be really good at what they're good at. Why do we like those? Is it because we're fascinated by watching someone who is skilled at something overcome every time, even at the end of Act 2 when things are worse than they ever could have been, and yet they still pull out of it? Is that why we're interested in that? I don't know. You got thoughts on that? I'm curious if anything struck you.
I'm not
there.
sure I have thoughts on that, but Matthew Dix has thoughts on that. So in his book, he talks about, he breaks down some movies in how movies are often not about what an LA audience would think they are. So for example, when he talks about James Bond, he says, so James Bond is a movie about faith. It's about believing something that you have one of the things is about believing something you have no evidence for. Because in James Bond, in the Ark of the Covenant, he's this super cynical guy. He doesn't believe in anything, and they're trying Indiana Jones, yes. Not James Bond, Indiana Jones. So, and he, the Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? So he's trying to find the Ark of the Covenant, and he, doesn't believe this thing is real. He doesn't believe there's any power to it. And then at the very crucial scene of the movie, the villains, who are very politically incorrect, all ethically, they're all of a certain ethnicity and they're all kind of cliched, but anyway, they find the Ark. And because they don't actually believe that the Ark has any power. And Indiana Jones looks at them about to open the Ark, and he realizes, no, there's something here. This, I don't want to be close to this thing. So at that moment, he believes. And they don't. They open the Ark, and they're dead. Right? Yes. So he says, there is an element of transformation. There's also, Indiana Jones is a complicated fellow who has daddy issues. Okay, so that's another thing, which is, his attitude to women is kind of weird as well. So he's a very fallible character, so at least compared to James Bond. So there are things in there that you could go, okay, I'm kind of like this guy. Sure. James Bond is a tougher case to make. I think it's just a cool adventure, and they make him human here and there, but the new ones make him human. But the old ones are just like, oh, it's just cool to see this basically superhero doing the superhero things. Yeah. Superman is popular, or was popular for a very long time. Batman is way more interesting than Superman, but that doesn't mean Superman wasn't popular for decades and decades. People just, I think, like this idea of this high achiever person doing these high achieving things.
It's funny, as I was mentioning Indiana Jones, something in me caught, because I know for a fact there is transformation there. The first one, he says at the beginning, he says to his buddy, he says, I don't believe in all this superstitious stuff. Cut to the end, close your eyes, Marion. Everything's going to go sideways. The second one, he starts off by talking about fortune and glory. Want some fortune and glory. By the end, he's rescuing all these children slaves. The third one, it's the daddy issues one. And by the end, him and his father have a good relationship. So you're right. I think when it comes to James Bond, and not to over chew on this bone, but I think when it comes to James Bond, there's a real wish fulfillment. There is this, I think what's enticing to us is, and I think this is sometimes true when we watch talks from big CEOs who we respect. Now, hopefully that CEO is talking about transformation journeys for customers, but I think there's a little something in us that likes to watch the strong, suave, cool people. And I guess I put Steve Jobs in this camp to some degree. We want to watch that talk because we want to feel like, gosh, could I be like that? What would it be like if I seemed to have all the right answers and all the right products and all the right things that I'm offering to my customers? Now, just like a James Bond movie, a lot of those Steve Jobs talks, they don't tell all the stuff behind the scenes. We had a long struggle to get to this product. We missed the boat on this one thing and we should have done this. It's the fallibility that we relate to, and yet I think we're always, maybe a good story hits both. Maybe a good story hits fallible person, achieve something great, and in that, there's that wish fulfillment that, oh, I would like to experience that. I would like to experience that transformation.
It could just be as well that stories work at multiple levels. And, we watch a James Bond movie or any of this, a big CEO giving a talk, and, it is inspirational, it's aspirational, there's all these other things. Sometimes just the actual thing they're describing is really interesting. It's a novelty. But it's unlikely to move us emotionally the way stories about more fallible, relatable characters move us. So I think it's, although when we teach story, we often talk about, so I'll always say that a good story has a relatable character with a problem they care about, and it's told through specific details in a moment in time or moments in time. That doesn't mean that you cannot have a great story that is super entertaining to watch or listen to that doesn't necessarily meet all those goals. Now, might just be this person or character who has an obstacle they're trying to overcome. I can't really relate to, but it's kind of cool. So I think not every story needs to move us emotionally to that extent. And that's why I think a lot of people do watch James Bond movies, but I would be surprised if a lot of people had one of those movies as their favorite movie.
Yeah, I could see that. I think as a coach, that my job is I'm like an art class teacher. I'm not going to go paint this, do this, do this. I'm there to come alongside them at the canvas and to talk to them about, again, I don't want to sound real highfalutin and think, oh, story's the end all be all, but I just want to help this thing come through. And yes, there's some science behind it. There's some beats you want to hit. But when it comes down to it, not all stories are the same. Not all stories accomplish the same thing, but there's a large swath of them. And we're trying to learn from the stories that have moved us so that I can help my clients tell stories that move their audiences, and ultimately that they look at their audiences as, this is cliche to say at this point because it's been said so often, but they look at their audiences as little heroes who are on their own journeys, of transformation, and the communicator, is acting as the sage who is stepping in there with something that they're offering to that audience, to each individual, to help them accomplish what they want to accomplish. Again, that's become so threadbare at this point. It's still worth repeating because a lot of people, they still go, well, as the speaker, I'm the hero, and that's not going to get anybody anywhere.
One question that comes up a lot when doing storytelling in business is how okay is it to use personal stories outside of a business context? So something that happened in your life, but not necessarily something to do with the work you're doing or work you've previously done. Where do you stand on that?
Well, it's helpful because it's going to build that bond. When let's say I'm a leader and I tell a story about me in college, or I tell a story about my family and I, well, just by it's almost like there's these rings, and the middle ring is our business, and so it's all safe to talk about this. But I talk about here might be like my hobby, and here might be my family, right here might be like my history. We're suddenly getting into these unknown realms that, as a leader, you may have heard about where I went to college, or whatever, but we're getting into these unknown realms. And as a leader, step into further unknown realms, I'm opening myself up to you. And that vulnerability is allowing the audience to know me a little bit better, and that we have more of that personal connection. I think that's when that oxytocin kicks in. The only caveat to that is why? Why are you going to this outer ring? Well, I just really I've heard it's important to be vulnerable, and I really want to be vulnerable. Okay, I don't see that as the driving force. The driving force to me will always be, I want to tell a story to prove a point. Now, if I can tell a story that proves a point, but is from one of these outer rings, great. So if you're trying to communicate to your team, let's go back to your example. Teamwork is the way to make the dream work. So I want all of us to do teamwork. Well, I could tell a story from the business and go, I remember 3 years ago when we were functioning this way in silos, and we did okay, that's fine. But if I go all the way out to like when I was a kid, and suddenly I go, I remember I was on the baseball team when I was 9, and I was the worst player on the team. And, you tell a story about baseball, and eventually my coach pulled me aside and said, you know why you're terrible? And I thought, who tells a 9-year-old they're terrible? You're terrible because you're playing individually. You're not playing as a team. And suddenly, I'm making this up, and suddenly I started to play as a team and hit the cutoff man and do all this stuff, and everything changed. I want that for us. Okay, so now I've brought in a personal story that's in one of these realms of vulnerability, but it also proves a point. If it's not proving a point, isn't this awkward when someone's telling a story that doesn't prove a point but is vulnerable? And I think the audience feels this weird tension of, I feel connected and I don't know why they told this. And your brain, because we're kind people for the most part, our brain goes, yeah, but it was good that they shared what they had felt. But I think our logical side's going, hey, pal, that really didn't have any purpose except to make you like them. I don't want that. I'm going to consistently drive my clients to stories that have to hit both. You've got to prove a point. Otherwise, save your vulnerable stories for your autobiography.
I agree. Right. Now, this is going to be a left field turn, but can we talk about God?
Sure.
So, one of the very first things that...
What? This is a left turn.
Well, but is it really? Because one of the very first things that anyone finds out when they start doing research on you is how big this is a part of your life, right?
Sure.
So your blog, which starts every post with a story, pretty much every single conversation you're having beyond the stories are conversations about God and religion and how that fits into your life and your audience's life. So, I don't want to talk about that in isolation, but what I wanted to find out is this. So, religion is, to a lot of people, a very big part of their life, right? And I think in the US, that's even more true than in other parts of the world. I think in Europe, no, if it is, it's not considered really an okay thing to talk about. Like, you would never talk about that in any sort of business context, but in the US I think that's less of an issue. So the first question I have is religion is a very, very rich source, or at least Catholicism, it's a very, very rich source of stories. Okay? And most of us are very familiar with those cultural references. So the first question I have on there is, did you ever either use those stories or either encourage or not discourage clients that wanted to use that type of story in a business context?
Yeah, so I'll unpack a little bit about my history real quick. I think what you tapped into is, to be honest, there's kind of two Jeff Davenports out there. There's the Jeff Davenport of, hey, I'm a Mr. Speaker coach, and we're going to talk about this, and you're going to do a big keynote. But my history is actually as a what we would call here in America a preacher or a pastor, and I worked at a number of churches. And real quick side transformation story was, and I tell this to almost all of my clients when I'm talking about delivery. When I was in high school and college, I was the shyest kid. I was a disaster socially. I couldn't stand up in front of a group of people. I was awful at that. And I ended up graduating college and then going to grad school. And over time, I ended up getting jobs as a teacher at churches, and I would go stand up in front of a bunch of people, and I had to learn how to talk in front of a group of people. And I feel like that was all used to bring me to where I am today. I like to continue to, a matter of fact, in a couple weeks, I'm preaching at a church here in town, and I like doing that because A, I like to communicate to people, help them see their lives more clearly. But B, I was just telling a client this yesterday, I don't want to be the fat tennis coach. I want to be the speaker. I want to be the speaker coach who's still speaking. Like, I still know what it feels like to get nervous in front of a group of people, or I got to put together my content. I'm still doing this myself. So I want to make sure that they can relate to me and I can relate to them. I think that when it comes to communicating about your religion and what you believe, I want people to be, you got to be hesitant. If you assume, let me just assume everyone in here believes what I believe. Well, all right, you're lost. Like, that's not going to do anybody any good. But if it is something, I remember I was working with one executive, a high-level executive, who, a strong Catholic believer, he would bring that in, but a very sensitive way. And where he would bring it in was, this is what's driving me, and this is what's driving where I want to go. What's driving you? And so he's saying, look, I'm telling from a personal standpoint. I'm not saying, so go be Catholic. He's saying, I've got a North Star within me, and all I want for you is, what's your North Star? Have you thought critically about what your North Star is? I'm not like, well, just hide everything. If you believe these things, just hide everything. It's not that. It's about just being sensitive to your audience. For me, the biggest thing about religion, which I don't even like that word, but the biggest, I'll put it this way. The biggest thing for me about a belief in God, I firmly believe that you can't believe in a God who gives a rip about human beings and not believe that humans can change. Like, that's part of the point, that I believe there's a God out there, and he looks at every individual human and says, I can grow you. I can grow you. And going back to what we've been talking about, I think that stories are about transformation. And so from my little perspective, someone wants to argue with this? Okay. But from my little perspective, I can't believe that humans change if God's not doing something in there. And I think when we tell stories of transformation, we're actually telling some sort of story that rhymes with God's story.
Okay, but you haven't answered my question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry.
No, to some extent you have. But
oh,
so
okay.
So let me try the very specific one, because I gave you kind of a broad canvas to paint on there with your answer.
Sure.
So, when you tell stories in a business context, apart from the story of how you became a speaker, do you ever tell any story that people could consider to be a religious story? Like, do you ever share a Bible story? Do you ever share a Jesus story or anything? Not your personal experience being, a preacher or anything like that, but because those arguably are just your personal professional experience. It just happens to be in a church. But would you ever use a Bible story, for example, in a speech or in a training or anything like that?
Probably not anymore. There was a time where you could bring in some story from, I would say, scripture, and there was a time in America where everyone would most of the people would at least have some passing understanding of that and be able to go, okay, I can go with that. As time goes on, and I would say, and I'm coming from a Christian standpoint, as time goes on, our culture is diverging away from that. And so to go, it's like when Jesus said this, a lot of the people in the audience are going, A, I didn't know that Jesus said that, and B, you're referencing him as some sort of higher authority that we all agree on, and I personally have not agreed to that. So right there, you're kind of shooting yourselves in the foot. Now, if you're able to tell that story in a way that says, and that story has impacted all these different people and all these different lives, you might get somewhere with that, but I find when you appeal to a higher authority, now I would say God is the ultimate higher authority, but like it's not that different than saying, okay, Steve Jobs said this. Well, that's pretty safe, but what if you choose someone who half the room can't stand? What if you choose some CEO who had a checkered past, or was part of the Me Too movement, or something bad, and you quote that person? Well, some people might be going, yeah, that does help me understand things because I respect that person. Half the other group is going, I don't even like that guy. I don't even like that person. Now you expect me to agree with you because of that? I would say that it's the same with religion. You're going to divide your audience. Now, if I have worked with organizations which were primarily Christian, it was an actual company. And so to reference some sort of scripture, everybody's going, yeah, great, we all agree on that. But I just don't want, how tone deaf would it be to assume if I bring that in, everyone will go along with it? I think that becomes very, very dangerous. What's know your audience. You have to know your audience. And I think that's one of the ways, if you mess that up, that's a surefire way to get people to go, yeah, I'm kind of done.
It's a strange turn of events that it's easier and more acceptable to appeal to Steve Jobs as a higher authority than God or Jesus. I'm not sure exactly what it says about our world. I don't think I'm equipped to make that judgment, but that is a pretty interesting development. I don't think most people would have seen that one coming.
That is an astute observation right there. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
But I think what we're also discovering is, it's silly to say this, but we're discovering humans are fallible. And we're discovering that even the people, this is part of the world we live in right now, we're all a little more suspect of everyone. And I think the bandwidth of humans who we can all agree we respect, just is getting narrower and narrower.
Yes.
And there was a time we were putting together a class at Duarte, and it was about public speaking, about delivery. And so we were bringing in these different examples of this communicator and this communicator. And we kept coming back to these presidents. And, okay, do we bring in this president? Do we bring in this president? And honestly, I think 20 years ago, we would have been pretty safe, because I think people would have gone, well, I may not have agreed with that person completely politically, but I like the way they communicated, or this. We ended up going, we can't bring anybody in. It could be somebody who's been dead for 100 years. Not that we were going to bring like McKinley in, but we couldn't bring those people in because immediately it's, well, I don't agree with that person's policies on this, and so I can't learn from them how to use my hands. And as much as I would want to cram and go, no, don't worry about it, just focus on, it's too loaded. It's a third rail. And so we've gotten to a point where anytime you bring up any politician, it's electrified. And I think that's now not just applying to politicians, but it's applying to business leaders and the people we all agree, no, they were good and we can learn from them, I feel like is getting smaller and smaller.
Yeah, it's a dangerous state of affairs where we are completely unable to set things apart, because even Steve Jobs, by all accounts, was not the best human being. He was definitely not a great parent. And no one seems to care about that when you talk about how great he was as a business leader or a creator or whatever. So I think that JFK, pretty fallible human being, but I think we can agree that he was a good speaker. I don't think that means that you cannot judge that. But on the Bible stories, I find this interesting because as a non-religious person, I could see myself very easily using a Bible story if I wanted to go there. But the way I would do it is I would frame it as just a story. So for example, I'd say, when I was growing up, some of my aunts were really religious. Like, the people that were like, they would lick their finger and do the sign of the cross on my forehead every time. I was like, stop it, it's disgusting. I don't even believe in this stuff. And she's like, it's fine. God doesn't care. This is true, by the way. I have these aunts to this day. And maybe one of them was really big into the Bible, right? So she would see me doing something stupid and she would tell me a Bible story. Right, so remember Samson? Remember what Samson did? And then she was like, what did he do? And then she would just tell me the story. So it would be very easy, I think, to sneak in Bible stories, which just, that you can. There's very few things you cannot find a Bible story as a good example or a good tale for. But I think it would have to be in this context of I'm sharing this with you as if it's fiction. I'm sharing as I would share a James Bond story. And remember that movie when James Bond did this thing? I think in that context, people will listen to it, and I don't think the defensive barriers would go up. Mine I don't think would go up if it was in that type of context. But to be fair, I mean, there's no shortage of stories. It's probably easy enough to stay away from some of the ones that could be divisive, even though what is not divisive these days
anymore. It's interesting because then what you're saying is it's similar to if I were to say, so let's think about Aesop's fable of the tortoise and the hare. Well, nobody's going to go, that's not a true story.
Yes.
Okay, it's not, but we can learn something from that. And isn't it interesting that just like if I told that story right now and I tried to put some business context around it, I think people would go, yeah, that's a helpful perspective on things. And right now I'm sitting here thinking, why? Like I'm trying to figure out what about me telling about a rabbit and a turtle is going to help you go, I really should be more conscientious in my work. And yet it would. It would. That's what I find fascinating because a lot of times, someone will bring in, I'm not against someone bringing in a fictional story. Like, hey, we saw, whatever the movie du jour is, you saw an Endgame, the Marvel movie, you saw the characters working together finally, and somehow that would actually move someone to go, you know what, I need to do that in my work. And I find that fascinating.
I think I know why. I have a theory as to why. And it will have to be the last thing I say because otherwise my kid will come back from school and will be on the street waiting for me. So what I think is just that the brain craves stories or examples, concrete ones, something you can kind of go, okay, characters doing something, I can see how that works. And most people talk in abstractions, they talk in theories, they talk in opinions. So when you give someone something like a metaphor or a story that's clearly not real but exemplifies the point with characters doing things for certain reasons, I think it just becomes easier to visualize. And if it's a cultural reference that we have, then it's, oh yeah, I heard the story a million times. I just never really thought about that in this context. So you're not saying that proves that this thing you're saying is true. All you're going through is, oh, I understand it better now. That's my theory.
Let me underline what you just said, because I think if anybody's listening, I would say what you just said is it, which is we all have a tendency to speak in these platitudes, these high-minded things, but only when you tell a story do you take that high-minded thing that you have to say and you help someone visualize it. You help them see it. I think that's it. I think that's really, for my money, and then what I'll be walking away from with today is that's as good a reason to tell a story as any.
And on that note, Jeff, if people want to find out more about you and what you're up to these days, where do you want to point them to?
TheLighthousePoint.com, TheLighthousePoint.com. Lighthouse Point Communications is our workshop, online course, coaching, got it all there. And I'm happy to help you or your team communicate more clearly, whether it's about storytelling or about delivery or about your presentation content. But Francisco, this has been an education and a joy to talk with you. You're nothing but fun, and I love the left turns.
See,
Get me on my toes.
I told you we didn't need a pre-call.
That's right. I said we're gonna do a pre-call, right? He's like, no, we're not. We're just diving in.
Don't do pre-calls.
That's great. I like that.
Okay, well, thanks for coming, Jeff. This has been absolutely fantastic.
Thanks, Francisco. Appreciate you.